Welcome to the latest episode of Five on the Floor of the Five Reasons Sports Network. Thanks for joining us on your favorite podcast app on Apple Podcasts, on Android, Spotify, or the Five Reasons YouTube channel. Also, make sure you subscribe to Off the Floor. That's our Discord server. You need a place to vent these days. This is the place for the most heat information and conversation and consternation. You can check it out. I'm going to add that to the liner here. You can find the link right here in the description. You click on that one. You bypass the Apple upcharge. You pay the $2.99 a month. And you're in. You can also cancel at any time. Also, check out the great sponsors of the Five Reasons Sports Network. Includes Prize Picks. Use the code 5 FIVE. Get $50 to play right away. You can play across the sports spectrum. Make the Heat season interesting. Play Prize Picks. You can also, of course, play it on all the other NBA players. You can get it at the Google Play Store, the Apple App Store, or PrizePicks.com. The key is use the code 5 FIVE. Helps you, helps us sustain all the content that we put here on the network. So again, use the code 5 at prizepicks.com. And now, today's episode.
Mercy, luxurious, Heat Nation, yeah, Mercy and Lago, down in Biscayne, yeah, five on the floor. Ride for my dogs, where here's the thing, you can check the score. Hustle hard, couple scars, wearing bubble frauds. Down in Biscayne, kept the floor playing, got it all banned. Y'all seen the block, stop with one hand. And Pat we trust, inspire, have the guts. We're here to bring the heat, y'all can hang it up.
Welcome to Five on the Floor, a daily insider show on the Miami Heat and the NBA, featuring Ethan Skolnick, Greg Sylvander, Alex Toledo, Brady Hawk, and others from the Five Reasons Sports Network. Also, make sure to subscribe to Off the Floor for the most heat anywhere.
And here's today's floor plan. We just want to tell you we're with you. We are suffering with you. We are going to continue to suffer with you on a daily basis until this is over with. And then after it's over with, we're going to spend 2 full months suffering with you as you propose draft pick suggestions and what the Heat should do in free agency. We are officially at the none of this means anything point of the season. And I hate to say that because we are a Heat podcast, but like none of this means anything. We're watching Groundhog Day. I'll just acknowledge last night's game. I didn't watch all of it. Greg came down with something, hadn't been feeling good. So Alex and Brady were at the game, but I did pick up some of it, joined on playback in the chat, at least in the fourth quarter, and saw they were up.
You didn't miss much.
and knew they would lose. And then I went down a rabbit hill of clutch statistics, which I'll get to in part in this episode. I mean, it is what it is. They're not going to move up. They're not going to be in one of the top 6 playoff spots. It's over. It's over. Okay, they have been passed by Detroit, a franchise that has not been able to get off the mat for like a decade. Figured it out this year behind Cade Cunningham, and they're not catching them. They're not catching Indiana. They're not catching Milwaukee. End of story. This is all about where they're going to be between 7 and 10. That's it. And then they just lost to the team that's most likely to be in 10. In fact, they've lost to that team twice now. So if you're thinking about a 9-10 play-in game, the odds are they will lose it with the way that they're playing now. And it's the same story. They get a lead, they lose a lead, rinse, repeat, regret. Rinse, repeat, regret. That's their slogan this year. We should put that on a T-shirt. I mean, I don't mean to be so negative. I know that they're competing, but it is what it is. But what we're going to try to do today is we've got like a podcast list of topics, like 10 different topics we want to get to before the end of the season. I'm not trying to hit for everyone's, you didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about that. We're trying to spread them out a little bit, again, because the games themselves are getting a little bit repetitive here. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to try to put this season in some perspective in Heat historical lore here. And I don't know if lore is the word to use, but we're going to try to, Greg and I, we tend to do more of the narrative history episodes because Brady and Alex are 12 years old. So I'm going to do the, why the hell Terry Rozier is 3rd on the team in clutch minutes this year, which he is. And he's a minus 16 net in those minutes. I'm going to do those with Brady or Alex. Tyler Hero's clutch play has not been good at all. We may touch on that a little bit here.
Going away from Bam late. Don't get me started.
Going away from Bam late. We also will do a couple positive episodes about Bam, specifically like what he's becoming, what we thought he could become. It's just like there was this 3-month delay at the beginning of the season, which was very problematic for this team, because maybe if that didn't happen, maybe the Jimmy situation doesn't blow up the way it does. You don't know, okay? I mean, everything, it's butterfly effect. But they needed this Bam earlier. They didn't get it. Now they've got that Bam, and they've got some hero that's not the hero who made the All-Star team. So it's never getting these things in the same space. And so we'll talk about all those topics and why they're going to hero so much late instead of Bam, when Bam's numbers late are good. Although actually his net rating in the clutch is not good. It's actually worse than Tyler's, but his scoring efficiency is better than Tyler's. Anyway, we're going to try to put this season in some perspective with other seasons. Okay. Again, you've been a fan of this team forever. You started obviously coming from more of a podcast perspective than you've been with us now, I think, for 4 years, I believe. And so me, I'm old as dirt, and my first year covering the Heat was 96. Okay. So I've seen all of these years. All right. And the season that I had targeted as this being most like, and this should give some hope to Heat fans, because it was a very frustrating season, is the 14-15 season. And so those who are not familiar or don't remember, it's after LeBron left. Okay, so the timelines here are going to be a little different because LeBron left in the offseason, as we know. Okay, and the Heat at that point tried to keep it together behind two players, Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. Similarly to how they're trying to keep it together now behind Tyler Hero and Bam Adebayo. Okay. And obviously Bam and Tyler are earlier stages of their careers. They're not champions, although close. Bam's case, he had a lot to do with getting close a couple times. And so you had a couple of building blocks, so to speak. And you were getting over, and what is the Heat are right now, the loss of a star. Okay, in one case, LeBron James, and the guy who had become, because again, Dwayne during the Big Three era, he was still kind of at that peak, and then it kind of started to go the other direction. He wasn't very available the last 2 years. He had moments, of course, he had moments. He was Dwayne, but he wasn't the same player as he had been, and so it's again a different stage of his career than some of these, but he still could be Dwayne, but you really didn't know physically what he was going to be going into the future. It was really the year after this one that Dwayne kind of started to get his body back a little bit. Okay, so you had these two players, and again, you getting over now. Jimmy, of course, LeBron left on his own. Jimmy forced his way out, so to speak. So you're trying to figure out how to put this thing together after you've lost a couple of players. You also sort of had in that case, you had Luol Deng, who you signed in the offseason. Okay. I'm not going to say Luol Deng was your Terry Rozier or anything like that. I'm not going to do that to Lou. But you had Lou in place. And just to go over that roster and what was still left, and I'm going to let you jump in here. What was still left was the 14-15 roster. This is at the beginning of the season, okay? Before they made a trade, and we'll get into that. You still had UD on the roster. You still had Norris Cole and Mario Chalmers on the roster, who had won championships for you. You had actually brought back Michael Beasley. So the roster at that point, and you still had Chris Anderson from the championship teams. But of course, you had added Danny Granger and Josh McRoberts and Sean Williams and Henry Walker. And of course, the Granger McRoberts thing was controversial because these were two players that LeBron didn't like, that the Heat went in and brought in before LeBron ultimately left, which he was going to leave anyway. But I'll always remember the conversation I had with Mike Miller, who I still communicated with at that time. And he texted me once and he's like, so when you going to Cleveland? And this was during the week LeBron was making his decision. I said, what do you mean? The Heat think LeBron's staying. I said, he ain't staying. They just got Granger and McRoberts. Get out of there. So anyway, that's what the roster was. Okay. Now we're looking at this roster and what was retained before the trade. what was still here? You still have Haywood Highsmith, player who's contributed to some winning for you. Duncan Robinson, player who's contributed to some winning for you. I mean, and you still, and you had Terry Rozier, who you brought in last year, who obviously you had higher expectations for. I'll ask this right now: before they made the trade for Dragic, okay, which is what we're going to get into, which they made that trade during that season. And before they made this trade for Wiggins, well, you can't because Jimmy's gone. So let's say include Wiggins. Is this roster currently better or worse than the one that they had prior to trading Norris and draft picks for Goran?
Well, it's tough because like I have the benefit of hindsight and knowing what happened with Chris Bosh, but I think if that didn't happen, there could be more of a conversation there. I think they're pretty close, honestly. I think Bam and Tyler are not as accomplished as Bosh and Wade were, but considering the stage of Dwayne's career where he obviously if we're thinking about this is pre-purple shirt guy moment in the playoffs. So Dwayne still had lots of juice left in him from a competitive and productive standpoint, but it wasn't necessarily an every night kind of thing. It was kind of like more you had to pace yourself and stuff like that. And I know we're going to get into the trade here in a bit, but the big parallels for me is that there's always seasons in Heat history that either there's like a cloud that has kind of formed over the roster and you don't see yourself through it initially and the seasons never really get off the ground. And these feel like 2 seasons as we look at 15-16, or excuse me, 14-15 and this season, it feels similar. I mean, that team finished, and we're going to talk about the second half of the season here in a minute, but it finished 37-45. So several games under 500, third in their division. The Heat are trending in that direction. As we record this today, the Heat would have the 11th pick in the draft. Like they are 9th. They're on the outside looking in of the play-in at this current moment. They would start on the road if we started today. And so to me, it's 2 teams. And I think the Goran element, having a busy trade deadline, also there's parallels because that team, and we'll talk about that now, they added Goran at the deadline and tried to make a mad dash for a playoff situation. Obviously, Bosh wasn't out there and it came up short. And it just feels like this is similar in that it's a team that they're going to try hard as hell to get out of this play-in scenario or get as high up in the seeding as possible. But I don't know that reality is going to agree with them in that sense.
Yeah, and again, some of the parallels become challenging because they traded really no. I love Norris, okay, but they didn't trade, and he was supposed to be a starter that season, but it wasn't. They didn't trade the star to get him, like say had to trade Jimmy to get Wiggins, Davion Mitchell, Kyle Anderson this year. So there's some parallels that aren't exactly the same. And just one thing on that season, because you talk about never getting off the ground, I do want to mention this before I get into the Bosh Wade versus Hero Bam thing, which is really where I want to start this, is that if you look at that season, all we heard was, and this sounds kind of funny in retrospect, but they had signed Deng, right? Now, Deng to me has parallels as a player to Wiggins, actually.
Agree. You almost have to, before you
Yeah.
go on, let me just sneak this in. You almost have to think of this because of the fact that the timelines are off, is that it's almost like they traded LeBron for Goran and Deng, and in this scenario, Jimmy for Wiggins and whoever else we want to tack on there. Yeah,
Davion, etc. Okay, so, and that's true, and I think it's tough. But if you look at that season, what we heard, okay, was if we could just get the starting lineup healthy. That was more of a health thing, which is kind of what we've heard in the last of the Jimmy years. If we could just get the lineup healthy, which they've been relatively healthy this year. Okay, honestly, if you look at most of their core players, they're playing more. Pat got Hero. Bam has always played a lot. Okay, but Hero, and then they acquire Wiggins, and he immediately misses half the games, which is not something he's typically done over the course of his career. But so that year, what we heard was if they could just get the starting lineup healthy. Now, what the starting lineup was supposed to be was Norris Cole at point, because he had passed Mario at that point in their eyes. They still had Chalmers, but they wanted to see Norris as a starting point guard. It was supposed to be Cole, Wade, Deng, Bosh, and McRoberts. Okay, that was McRoberts
Whiteside.
before. No, but he wasn't there yet. That's the thing. I'm going to add him. I forgot. He
Oh
was
my
not.
gosh, that was that year. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, I just looked that up because my mind had. I just looked that up. So we're going to touch on Hassan. But at the time, the idea was supposed to be Bosh at the center and
You're right.
McRoberts at the 4. And I think that lineup, mostly because of McRoberts at the start, I think that lineup played like 7 minutes together.
Yeah.
Like it never happened. We kept hearing about what they were gonna look like with those 5. I think in retrospect, probably a little ridiculous, but that was the thing. It never happened. And it does feel like in this case, they're just things that are never going to happen that we've talked about. And them holding leads is the thing that is never going to happen this year. I don't see, and again, we're going to do more of this in other podcasts. I don't want to get too deep into it. I don't see any kind of a breakthrough coming in that regard. And I don't want to disrespect Eric Spoelstra in this because he has been right before and we have been wrong. They're not learning anything. It's the same thing every night. It's the same thing. Okay. They don't have it's in their heads at this point, which means it's going to spiral and it's going to get worse. Okay. So that's kind of the deal. So I feel like that's going to become a little bit problematic for them. All right. So let's look at the Wade, on the other side of this. Okay. I want to look at the Wade Bosh part of this as in comparison. Before we do, I want to tell you about a great sponsor of the 5 Reasons Sports Network. And now it's time for Who's on the Move, sponsored by our friends over at Cousins USA Moving and Storage, family owned and operated since 1996. They can service both residential and commercial moves, whether you're going across town, across the state, across country, and even across the globe. They have a 15,000 square foot private warehouse in Lauderhill, Broward County. The number one priority for Cousins Moving is transparency and being honest with their customers. They have a very low turnover, with most of their movers working for them for over 10 years. So find them online at Cousins Moving on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, or visit the website at www.cousinsusa.com/5RSN. They've got an exclusive offer through 5RSN. You get 5 free wardrobe boxes with your next move, so there's no need to pack your clothes away in suitcases. Just mention 5 reasons. And now, who's on the move? Okay. All right, I want to thank our sponsor, Cousins Moving. Hopefully there will be moves that the Heat make this offseason that upgrade this roster, but we're going to pivot into that now. So let's start with what you have, okay? So the Heat that year added 2 players of significance. One was Goran Dragic, who they acquired for Norris Cole and I believe 2 picks, right?
Maybe 3.
Right. And the other came out of nowhere, which was Hassan Whiteside. So they added Hassan Whiteside. At that time, Hassan was a former, I believe, 2nd-round pick. There were a lot of questions about motor, among other things. Not really about ability, but nobody saw the triple doubles coming. I remember being in Cleveland, unfortunately, but I was covering LeBron up there that season as part of my contract for Bleacher Report. They sent me up to Cleveland. And I remember being at a Cavs game, and the Heat were playing Chicago that day.
Mm-hmm.
And people were stopping to watch this. This was a national TV game. People were stopping to watch this in like the bar because who was this guy who was doing these kind of things? Okay?
Triple doubles with blocks.
Triple doubles with blocks. Like for however the thing with Hassan ended, you have to remember how it began, which was this sensation. This guy was putting up crazy numbers, okay, at the very start. So they added a piece that nobody expected, that they didn't think was going to be that. I also remember having a conversation with David Griffin of the Cavs at that time, because I asked him, I said, why don't you guys sign Hassan? You guys need another big. They ended up trading for Mozgov that year because they needed a big to play with that team. And he basically he talked about some of the processing stuff that would become that they had heard about that would later become an issue for the Heat. But the Heat added this guy out of nowhere. Okay, so I'm just saying that to say that there are unexpected things that can happen to rosters. The Heat could, one of these guys, one of these undrafteds, maybe it's if they finally give Kashad Johnson some playing time, could make some kind of an impact. Not a Hassan impact, but we have to at least acknowledge the fact that it's possible. But going back to before the Dragic edition here, or even after the Dragic edition, if you start with Bosh and Wade and you start with Bam and Tyler, who would you say? And we're saying before Bosh got sick, which was another thing that they could not predict. Okay. I mean, literally, the first time he went to the hospital was the day they acquired Dragic. They couldn't even be happy for a little bit of time. You talk about frustrations. Okay.
The worst.
Who would you say was the best player of those four at that time? Bosh, Wade, at that time. We're not talking about pedigree. Bosh, Wade, Bam, and Tyler.
I'd have to say probably Bosh, sight unseen, not knowing what was about to hit, obviously. But I would say at that moment, it's Bosh followed closely by Bam. I think Bam has a chance to be a better player than Bosh long term. But again, Bosh had won championships. He was still in the midst of his prime, quote unquote, prime years. Still just got maxed. So I think like that, he's probably atop the list.
Okay, I would agree with you. The last month of Bam is making me think we could be in a position where it's even.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know me as a Bam
no, I know.
fan.
I know.
I'm gonna lean in that direction. I think starting next season, you're gonna see this type of Bam a lot more, but that's another pod.
Now, and we've talked about Bam's efficiency being good in the clutch. Bosh was excellent in the clutch. Excellent. Was the best of the big three, by the way, during the big three era in terms of his clutch stats. Okay. And of course, people remember specific instances without Dwayne and LeBron at times in Portland, in Atlanta, in San Antonio. People remember those games. The big shot Bosh, right? Okay, that's what you got in those situations. They don't play through Bam the way that they played through Bosh when either LeBron or Wade was out. Okay, if they played through Bam more, we might see more of it. And that's the next part here. And again, we'll do another podcast on it, is just deciding to play through Bam late, okay, and living with whatever the consequences are, because the consequences can't be worse than what they've been doing it other ways. All right, let me get to this, and this is a loaded question. At that stage of their careers, coming off the Big Three era, okay, in which we know that Dwayne missed a lot of time, didn't have the same responsibilities he had early in the Big Three era, certainly before that, that Dwayne Wade versus this Tyler Hero.
You ain't gonna catch me on a podcast taking Tyler Hero over Dwayne Wade. I'm not putting my name behind that. I love Tyler's game this year. He's been awesome, but Dwayne Wade still was Dwayne, and especially if you pissed him off, he was Dwayne at that moment.
Yeah.
So, and I have the benefit of hindsight, so I know that purple shirt guy series was still in there somewhere, and obviously, even when he came back to the Heat much later, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about, he still had his Dwayne moments. So I'm just not ready because we haven't honestly seen it for a full season with Tyler yet. And that's another topic for another day of what happens if Tyler does not kind of get back to how he played earlier in the year. But yeah, I'm not going on record as putting Tyler in front of Dwayne. We're going D Wade here.
Do you know what the huge storyline was in the 14-15 season? Do you remember? Related to Wade?
No, I don't. Not off the top of my head. What was it?
He took at least 7 long twos in clutch situations that didn't go.
That's right.
I remember pulling Spo aside during that season and asking him, "Are you going to keep doing this? Like, is this?" I mean, I didn't ask it quite that way, but Eric a little different on the side than he is in the group, which is, again, is why I tell people when they keep saying to me, like, "Why aren't you grilling him about Terry Rozier? You know, the Inquisition." He's been asked. He's going to give a certain answer publicly. It's just how he is. I asked him about Wade, and he looked at me like I was a crazy person, which he's done over time. Okay, I've known him since we were 26 and 23. We're no longer that. And he looked at me like I was a crazy person. He says, "I will go to my grave with Dwayne Wade taking the last shot at the end of the game." And then he started saying that publicly. That was the narrative on Dwayne at that point. You go back and check it. It wasn't all positive. It was not. This is not the same Dwayne as the beginning of the Big Three era.
For
And
sure.
he's acting like he is. Okay, man. They came into that season and the idea was to play through Bosh. You know the whole controversy this year about pivoting away from Jimmy and going more to Hero, and specifically in Rozier, which
Parallels.
a lot of other parallel. They were getting away from in that case a little different because I'm sort of been looking at Jimmy and LeBron as the parallel, but in that case their decision was we're going to play through Bosh. That was a total pivot that they were doing. Okay, it was another thing that Dwayne, as he's spoken about more of this stuff on podcasts, but he wasn't thrilled about that at the time either. Okay. And people thought he was hijacking the offense late. He kept taking those shots. You remember Purple Shirt Guy, which was the next year when Dwayne was rejuvenated, and he made those shots in that series. But we didn't know that Dwayne was still in there because we were not seeing that Dwayne consistently. I was a podcast host. Well, not podcast. I hosted on 790 The Ticket at that time. Okay.
And the Heat were having the same doubts because they haggled on contracts for following off seasons, including that one. So I mean, it was all inclusive in terms of people kind of doubting Dwayne.
I'm just saying that to say that you're not going to hear me take Tyler Hero over Dwayne Wade on a podcast either. But I'm just saying it's not. Looking at what Tyler was doing earlier this season and the season he was putting together, it's not statistically. Tyler's numbers this year are better than Dwayne's were then. But again, the context with Dwayne is what it is. Okay, so you're starting with that. Okay, now let's look at the rest of what you got. So you had at that point, again, assuming health for Bosh, you had then Whiteside, who was this phenomenon, but you didn't know how it was going to fit. You had Luol Deng, who was disappointing in his first year. He was. He was not, and he also had this thing over him, which was Pat calling him the most important signing in Miami Heat history as a spite press release to LeBron, which put undue pressure on Deng. Okay, and he was not great that first year. Lou was great the next year after Bosh got sick, and Spo put him at the 4, and Luol had a terrific season. Okay, but he was not great that year. Okay, you had, I guess, Norris was gone after and you still had Chalmers, who was telling me every day, why won't these MFers get rid of me if they don't want to use me? Okay, so I mean, you had kind of a weird context team here, right?
You found Tyler Johnson along with Hassan Whiteside. As I'm looking
just
through
like
here,
this,
he was another guy.
He was another guy, and again, everything in time. Tyler Johnson is now remembered as somebody they paid too much money to, but at the beginning, he was a nice kind of role player who could score a little bit, had some toughness. He was a little overmatched defensively, but he competed. So again, you had some pieces. Overall roster after the Dragic, and then you added Goran Dragic, who was coming off all third team All NBA, and was only another of these disgruntled players that they went and got. And he and Ryan McDonough did not get along at the end, but everybody was excited about that acquisition. Nobody said he was LeBron, but it was like, okay, we're rejuvenating this mix. You added Wiggins this year. Wiggins is a former number 1 overall pick. He's been a champion. He's never reached the individual heights that Goran did at the end there, but again, a nice addition. And you've added Davion Mitchell, who is a piece. Okay, I think he's a piece. I think he's a piece you re-sign. I don't know if he's a long-term starting point guard. I know he wants to be. He was on our podcast. He talked about the opportunity. But he's definitely a rotation player on a good team. I don't think there's in this system with the way that they want to play. I think Davion Mitchell's a rotation player on a good team. Okay, which of these rosters prior to the Bosh sickness is better?
That's a tough call because you have to remember that like this Heat roster includes Jovic, Jaquez, Ware, so there's young talent that you are kind of developing as you go here, and you're trying to get back into contender status. I would say that it's pretty damn even, but I'd give a slight edge to this group top to bottom, maybe. And that may sound a little crazy, but I think that it's just it seems deeper to me than what you had back then. And so I don't know if obviously. And I do have the benefit of hindsight. So everything I'm going to say is going to be a little bit tilted because I have the the lenses with which to view it that way. But I would say top to bottom, you have probably a more talented roster here. Now, obviously, we're going to also talk about what the Heat did that summer to try to supplement what they had with Goran and Hassan at that time that they found, and Deng and Wade and Bosh. But I would say with the young talent on this roster, I'd give it a slight edge. Am I crazy there?
You're not crazy because of the potential of some on this roster, and the Heat's. The one thing they have proven is they can well, this year's been a step back with Jaquez, which is unfortunate. But the one thing they've proven is that they can find guys and develop guys. And at that point, we weren't really in that space. They hadn't pivoted to that. Like Hassan, again, was like a meteor that they didn't expect. But the real development stage kind of came after that with a lot of these guys. I mean, yeah, you can go back in history and say Joel Anthony and Udonis Haslem and a bunch of Anthony Carter, a bunch of undrafted. But I'm talking about there was a pocket during the Big Three era. They really didn't develop a lot of guys. There wasn't room for them. We Terrell Harris, Mikal Gladness. They tried to bring in like the Eddie Currys and the Greg Odens of the world, but they did not have that kind of development culture that Spo developed sort of in the late teens, of this, in terms of where they were going. So it's a little bit different. We didn't really know where it was coming from. And again, I don't think they had a young player on that team going into the 15 off season, which is, I know what you want to talk about.
Yeah.
They didn't have a young player with the upside of Kel'el Ware. Okay.
I mean, Hassan
sure.
might have been looked at as that.
Yeah.
As you're unpacking it, I'm starting to think about like ramping up for that next season, and we'll talk about what they added. But like we thought the starting lineup was going to be Goran, Dwayne, Deng, Bosh, and Whiteside. I have to be honest. Maybe I had higher hopes for that group, as I say it now out loud, than I do for what they currently have now. So maybe I'll say it's maybe a wash. Like, and I hate to be wishy-washy, but it's tough as I think back on it. I think I was a little higher on that group the next year than I was on this group now.
You probably were. I think we all were, because we looked at it like, oh my God, if you get this Hassan,
yeah, with that Bosh and that Dwayne,
yeah. Right. But here's the thing, and this is what we found: fit matters. Even before Bosh got sick, and I know we're going to pivot back to the 15 off season. Even before Bosh got sick, and he had it the first time, but before he went out the second time, okay, which was All-Star Game 2016 in Toronto, we found out that the second blood clot. It wasn't really fitting. Wade and Dragic did not fit for a long time. Okay, Goran would go stand in the corner. Again, Dwayne still. There was a lot of anti-Dwayne stuff at that time.
I was screaming, give Goran the keys. I remember that.
Yes. Okay. And there was the without Wade movement at the end of the Big Three era. We've gotten past all this because as soon as they scorned Dwayne, okay, in the perception of people, there's a lot more that went into that situation. But like in the 15, 16 off seasons and everything that happened with that, it was like then everybody forgot that Dwayne was kind of a punching bag at times at the end of the Big Three era and just right after it. Oh, yeah. Okay. But the Goran Dwayne thing didn't really work. I stood with them and did like a 25-minute interview session about very quickly after Goran came in about how it was going to work. And it was clear to me, and then it was like a group interview, the two of them. And it was clear to me that Goran's reverence for Dwayne was a problem. Like, because Goran just loved Dwayne, and if everybody loves Goran, okay, but like he had this respect for Dwayne, like he was not going to get in the way, and Dwayne had never played with a point guard like this. He played with LeBron, who I guess was, but Chalmers, and these were, Rio thought he was the best player on the floor, but if you told Rio to go to the corner, he went to the corner. Okay,
Jay will too.
Right. Goran did it, but it didn't. That wasn't Goran's game. Goran's game was ball in his hands, attack, force triggers, all that kind of stuff, and that wasn't happening. Goran flourished mostly after Dwayne was gone, and he was playing with waiters, and they had the whole drive and kick game in the 16-17 second half of that season when they went 30-11. Okay. The other part of it that didn't work was Whiteside and Bosh.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't work. Spo tried the too big thing. Every single one played too big. Their numbers together were not good, and they were 20, and partially because Hassan was a black hole in there. Okay, but they were 26-22 at the break the next year before Bosh got sick. They took off when Bosh got sick again and was out. Deng moved to the 4.
Mm-hmm.
That team, and then they added Joe Johnson as a buyout guy, which another thing that the Heat could be doing going forward, but I don't think it's going to happen this year because nobody's going to want to join this team as a buyout player because they're not going anywhere. Okay, but let's get to the 15 offseason. I know we're going a little longer on this one, but the narrative ones and I think the history ones we need to. In the 15 offseason, what did they do, Greg? Because this is where there's another possible parallel to this team.
So they went out and looked for opportunities to get a superstar. Hint, hint at what they may do this offseason. And then when that didn't materialize, they brought back a very similar group, but because of where they finished in the draft, they brought in a 10th pick. And then obviously they got a second rounder as well that turned out to be a better career player in Josh Richardson. So Justice Winslow and Josh were added to a fairly similar team. And that's kind of where I'm pivoting, in that I think the Heat are going to look to get a superstar this offseason, like a Kevin Durant. If they're outbid or if the price is too steep, they could be in another situation where they basically can add 2 players in the draft to a team that's largely going to come back as it stands today. Obviously, they can maybe add a mid-level player, or there's opportunity for a young player to pop. I mean, maybe Jaquez is in a sophomore slump scenario and comes out and is much better next year. Nico should be healthy. So there's things to look forward to, as there was back then, but it could be a scenario where you're bringing back a lot of the same faces and then you're adding a couple rookies to the mix.
And let's get into what happened there. Okay. That team won a first round series in 15-16 without Bosh. Okay. And remember, they still had UD, by the way, too. I don't want to forget that. And he was not the same player towards the end of the Big Three era, but there was a certain stability that he added. And he had a huge moment, by the way, because there always seems to be a UD moment of some kind in that last game to close out Charlotte in the first round, where Dwayne and him were basically playing pick and roll with each other at the end of that game and clearing out everybody else. And they finished off a pretty average Charlotte team, but again, it was a fun series. They got to the series against Toronto. They took it 7. They didn't have Bosh. There was a lot of controversy at that time. Chris was with them, but he couldn't play. His family was wearing free Bosh T-shirts. There's a lot of stuff going on, and Whiteside got hurt, and then Justice Winslow had to play the 5 in the last game. But until that point, and with the context of Justice and what he didn't become, okay. As part of this, Justice and Josh made a huge difference on that team. Mm-hmm. They were essentially the 6th and 7th best players. They brought in Gerald Green that offseason, okay, and that didn't really work. But they had, but Justice and Josh, that was their defensive change of pace off the bench. And Josh, as the 40th pick in the draft, he went back and forth all year to Sioux Falls, but then when he came back, he had 1 month where he just lit the world on fire from 3, and he gave him a spark off the bench. Which is to say, okay, you can add impact in the draft. And it looks like they're going to have the Golden State pick. It's not going to be as high as maybe they wanted because Golden State's on a tear, but they're going to end up getting the pick. So assume that pick is maybe, remember, this is based on regular season record. The Warriors can win the championship.
It'll be around 20th.
Okay, so they're going to get the 20th pick, and they're likely going to keep their own pick this year, because if they end up not making it out of the plan, then they will keep their own pick, right? That's how this works.
As of today, by record, obviously the lottery can change your fortunes, but as of today, as we record this, if we were just to go in inverse order of record, they would be the 11th. They have the 11th pick.
Okay, so let's say they have 11 and 20. Well, that's better than 10 and 40 that they had that year. And this, by the way, that was supposed to be a pretty good draft. It didn't turn out to be that way. If you look back at it, a lot of what was it? Jaleel Okafor was in there, and a lot of busts. Okay, everybody remembers Devin
Booker
Booker.
and Miles Turner survived.
Right, but a lot of players picked before Justice, like Frank Kaminsky, did not work out so well. Okay, this draft is supposed to be better than that one. And so there is the potential to add more. And I guess as we close here, because we're at 40 minutes, we always try to find seasons that they're like. Nobody wants to remember the 14-15 season. It's ultimately forgettable. I remember Bill Walker or Henry Walker, I can't remember what his name was at the time, hitting a big shot, and Jack's interviewing him at the time at the end of the game. And I'm like, we just went from LeBron to Bill Walker. I mean, this is not fun for people. I get it. Okay. I guess we want to do this episode because they have been in these kind of ditches before. What you don't want is to stay in the ditch. And sometimes a ditch can be mid. It doesn't mean you go all the way to the bottom. They never do that, really, very rarely. But a ditch can be mid. My concern is not so much where they were in 14-15 and whether they can get to where they were in 15-16. It's what happened after 15-16. It's that they went 11-30 or whatever it was in the first half of the season. Then went 30-11, fooled themselves, I think, in some ways to thinking they had something, right? Re-sign more of those guys to contracts they shouldn't have, and ended up basically in a rut for a couple of seasons that additionally that only the Dwayne Wade coming back distraction has made memorable in Heat history until they got Jimmy in 19. You don't want to be there. Okay.
Yeah, that went too long.
It went too long. It went too long for Heat fans, and we can't take it anymore. Okay. Because they're now, the Heat right now are lower mid. The way they're not even mid, they're lower mid. The way that they're playing, I mean, you're losing to a Chicago team
they're
at
under
home
500.
They're under 500. Team without 4 core players. Okay, on your home floor, the Bulls are not playing for anything. They're stuck in the 10 at the play-in, and to lose that game is again deflating. But what I'm saying is they have found ways out of this before, and it's either you get a star if you really think that you can elevate this group that you have, all right, or you need to keep building young but high potential players as much as you can, okay, to get out of this. But the Rodney McGruder era, we can't, where they're
just don't give Dion and JJ again. Whatever that means in 2025 or 2026, don't do that again.
Right, exactly. So anyway, we don't mean to depress you on a Sunday morning if that's whenever it is that you're listening to this. So we are saying there is hope. This management team has figured its way out of a lot of different situations in the past, but there's also precedent for, a little bit of pain along the way, and that's the kind of season that we're suffering through right now. All right, Prize Picks, use the code 5. Cousins moving. We will have more episodes about the current team and kind of, how they tweak things. But I'm glad you didn't say the hero better than Wade thing, because you would never live that down on Heat Twitter. But
not me.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the 5 on the Floor on the 5 Reasons Sports Network. After all, someone needs to listen to my dad.